There are so many fonts and examples of typography that exist. But how do you start describing fonts and approach how to use them? Hi friends, thanks for being a part of my channel. I'm Jenny, and today I will be sharing 5 different ways to describe typography. You won't need anything for the video today, just look at things with text on them once we're done. And that should be a lot of things that are in your house right now. Today we're going to talk about the 5 ways to describe typography. The first way, number 1, stroke endings. Stroke endings are at the edges of the letter forms. So there's 2 different kinds of stroke endings that we're going to focus on. Straight with no serif, meaning there's nothing hanging at the end of the letters. And you're going to see that in like the Google font and other more modern looking typefaces. And then you also have serifs, which are things that are hanging off the end of the strokes. And in a lot of books, there's a lot of different examples of serifs. There are some modern websites that are starting to introduce serifs to kind of create more weight on the letter forms, because at a smaller size, serifs are a little bit easier to mark the entry and the beginning of a stroke and can help you distinguish a type when it's read at a small size. Some examples of stroke endings include hairline and slabs. So there's a number of different serifs out there. There's bracketed serifs. I'm just going to show you a couple of examples here. Hairline serifs are ones that are thin in comparison with their stroke, the vertical strokes. So they're very thin, like a hairline. There's also slab serifs, where the serifs are equal to the weight of the vertical strokes. But there's also a lot of other ways to describe serifs, and we can go into that a little bit later. But those are the main kinds of stroke endings that you see. I think the traditional ones look more like the ones here to the right. Things like Times New Roman, Minion, Garamond. A lot of them have very traditional, very traditional looking serifs, and are a good place to start if you're studying lettering and creating your own types of serif typefaces. So that is stroke endings. We have straight, they're also known as sans serif, and then you also have serif typefaces. So that's a really good descriptor to have in your arsenal when describing typefaces. And the number 2 for describing typefaces is weight. So weight would include things like light, medium, bold, even black. Fonts and foundries, they tend to kind of name it depending on however they feel, because that's just how they name it. It might be even in comparison with the other fonts in their typeface family. So one font's regular might look the same as another font's bold. But normally you can look at a typeface, get a sense of like whether or not it's light or semi-bold or black even. And the way that you can really understand this is by looking at the counter space, which is the white space or the negative space in between the letters. And the way that you can go about this is actually just by looking at the counter space. You're primarily looking at the counter space, and looking at the counter space, a more bold typeface will have a smaller counter space. Again, a bolder typeface will have a smaller counter space. And the opposite of that is true. With a lighter typeface, you have bigger counters. So that's the trick of recognizing whether or not a typeface is either light or bold, focusing primarily on the negative space and the active space, which is the black or like the main like letter form itself. And being able to recognize the difference between the active or the negative space can help you identify a typeface a little bit easier. That is weight. You have, that's number 2, which is weight. You have light, regular, semi-bold, bold, black. There's even extra light. There's heavy. There's a lot of different descriptors to them. But generally they're identifying different types of weight. Going on to number 3. Width is wide or narrow or condensed, compressed, condensed, narrow, regular, wide, extended. Again, these font names totally vary with the foundry and the type designers that name them. A good rule of thumb with identifying the width is how the glyphs fit into a square. A regular width, like a normal kind of like average width of a typeface, would fit very comfortably into a square. Now you look at the H, it's not exactly a perfect square, but it seems relatively balanced compared to their other width counterparts. If you're looking at the narrow versus the wide, they're different kinds of width based off the regular. This N is actually a very good example of fitting within a square and would help you identify better that it's a regular width. So use all of the information that you have to kind of help you identify what the font is. Maybe you would only have a few letters to go off of, and those letters can really help you identify what type of width you're looking at. So that is width. You have compressed, condensed, narrow, regular, wide, extended. Again, these names are totally going to change depending on what font you're in. So just be aware of that. There's no hard and fast rule, but you can just say wide or narrow or condensed, and that's a pretty generic way of describing the width of a typeface. Moving on to number 4, we have construction. So construction is how you would describe the build of the letters and the way the letters are formed. I can't really get as more precise of that, or figure out another way of saying that. But it's just the way that the letters are formed and constructed. So some examples of construction, of looking at construction, is the lowercase Romans, which is a generic way to describe lowercase Latin figures. And these are all like, if you look at the whole alphabet, things with an ascender, they go above the X height, as well as below a baseline with the descenders for G, J, P, Q, and Y. And then you have another type of construction, which are uppercase or capital letters. Uppercase and lowercase are actually two different types of construction. And the reason why is because you have letters like A and B and D, all looking very different than their lowercase Roman counterparts. So that means they're of a different construction. They kind like with letters like C or even the W or the X, they are very similar in terms of how they look, but their proportions are what make the construction different. And that is the difference between a lowercase w versus a lowercase w versus an uppercase W. So it's all about proportions. It's all about these pre-existing sets of rules that have existed for a while that create a lowercase construction and an uppercase construction. Another type of construction is actually italics. And introducing italics, upon first glance, it could just be observed that they're the lowercase Romans at a slant. But looking at just two letters, the lowercase a especially, italics look different and are constructed differently than their lowercase Roman counterparts. Looking at the A here, so this is considered a double story A, and that's because there's an arm and then there's also this bowl. When you're looking at the italic, it's only this giant loop that creates the A, and that is considered a single story A. And so the same thing applies when you look at the G. Most lowercase Romans for the G use a double story G. It has that circle with like an ear, and then it kind of like does this little road loopy thingy. That's a double story G. And the italic construction of that is the one on the right, and it looks like the italic A. It's a single story G. And that is what makes an italic. So Source Sans actually uses true italics when creating its italic font. For some typefaces, however, not all of them follow these italic versus lowercase rules. One such instance of that is Futura. And here is the lowercase Roman Futura in both A and G. And here is the italic version of the same letters A and G. They're just slightly slanted. I think I would call this more of an oblique versus an italic, but their font is called italic, but the construction isn't following italics. So I wouldn't call Futura italic a true italic. It'd be more of an oblique or a slant. That's just a preview of construction. You're looking at things like italics, pretty much looks like lowercase Romans, except for a few letters. And then you also have uppercase or capitals and the lowercase Romans. So that is construction. Moving on to number 5, contrast. So contrast, with typefaces and fonts that have contrast, you have a range, and they can vary between high contrast. Like this Dido, where the thins and the thicks vary very much between each other. They're very thin, just like the hairlines. They're very thin, and the strokes are very thick. So there's a lot of difference between the width of the thin strokes and the thick stroke. For low contrast, there is almost no visible difference between the thicks and the thins. So looking at this source sans, there is almost no visible difference between the thicks and the thins. If you look at the one on the left where the thins are, it looks about the same as the thicks. But if we get even closer to the source sans, you see that there's a very slight thinning of the arm coming out of the thick in the stem, and these are always adjusted with the type designer. The type designer always tends to make these kinds of adjustments with the typeface. It still looks right. You don't ever want, there's always going to be some sort of adjusting that is made to make it look less bulky, or in this case, a regular weight. And so those adjustments are made on a letter to letter basis. But if we look at the O, it's completely the same all the way around. So this would be a low contrast typeface. So that is contrast. You have the difference between the thicks and thins of the letter forms. So that was number 5, but I'm going to give you a bonus descriptor here, and that is contrast type. So we talked about contrast, the difference between thicks and thins. Now contrast type is actually the rules that distinguish where the thicks and thins should be going. And this is looking at the 2 types of contrast: expansion and translation contrast. Expansion contrast comes from the rules that are set from a pointed pen, and it comes from round hand or copper plate calligraphy, where the more pressure on a stroke creates the thicks, and the upward, the light pressure of the stroke creates the thins. So that comes from existing rules in design, in calligraphy, like copper plate or round hand, and that's the rules that are set from the limitations of a pointed pen. The second type of contrast is translation contrast, and that is set from the rules and the limitations from a broad nib or a broad edge kind of pen, like a parallel pen would have that, or an italic pen, things that the width of the nib is fixed. So broad edge or broad nib pen. That inspiration for the contrast, where the contrast is, comes from type like black letter, like fracture, or italics, where people have been using a broad edge or broad nib pen to create their letter strokes. The way that you can distinguish the difference between what type of contrast it is by looking at where the thins and the thicks are in the strokes. So I like to focus on the O's, because the O's are the biggest giveaway of where the contrast is. Looking at the O for the Dido, the thins are at the top and the bottom. So if you're looking at black letter, where you're doing calligraphy for black letter, it goes from the thin at the top left and the bottom right. Again, that's the thin goes at the top left and the bottom right. And that's how you can understand that is supposed to be a translation contrast by looking at the O, and then all of the letters will be following that type of contrast. That is the bonus descriptor of type of contrast. And we went through 5 different types of contrast. We went through stroke endings, we went through weight and width, construction, contrast, and type of contrast. And that is about it. Hopefully this helps you start understanding different ways to describe type. So the next time you're looking at different letters in books or signs, try to describe them using the characteristics we talked about. How does the same design use different characteristics to look different from each other? And did I miss any characteristics that you use to describe type? Drop a comment below and we can start a conversation on even more ways to describe fonts and how they're used out there. I appreciate you for being a part of my channel. If this was valuable and you'd like to see more typography, graphic design, and calligraphy related videos, let me know by liking and subscribing below. The second type of contrast is translation typeface. This is fun.